What is causing the current inflation crisis? Are we headed into a major recession? Economist Richard Werner is with us. He is the author of best-selling book Princes of the Yen. He also exposed the rebooting of the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders program as a controllable group. He advocates for decentralized planning and community banks, calls out the central banking system as a means of control. He's also the inventor of quantitative easing, also referred to as printing money, which interestingly many blame for the current inflation crisis. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining us today on the show. You predicted the inflation crisis back in early 2020, before the war, before the energy crisis we're having, before supply chain crisis. What was it that you saw in early 2020 that led us really to where we are today?
Well, exactly. That's a key question because it was before these events, and I don't claim I predicted, the military events in Ukraine or anything. I focused only on the credit creation, which is the money creation going on in the central banking systems and the banking systems, and this is controlled by the central banks. And that was sufficient to be quite sure that there was going to be significant inflation, which I put out that forecast in May 2020. There's usually a lead time of around 18 months. And so what happened then last year, that inflation was the result of central bank policies. It was a kind of QE. And it took most people by surprise because they had got used to QE like in 2008, not creating inflation. But that's a bit of a misunderstanding. There's different types of QE. And the original QE, which I recommended for Japan in 1995, was for a situation where you have a bust banking system. So the banks are not actually creating money. And you have the problem is there's shrinkage in the money supply, you've got deflation. And that's when you need to very quickly expand the money supply if you don't want a big and long recession. Now, the Bank of Japan did not take my advice, which was the following, namely two things. Number one, the central bank should purchase the non-performing assets from banks. That's to clean up their balance sheet. And when the central bank does it doesn't cost the taxpayer anything. And importantly, secondly, in order to kickstart money creation and expand the economy, the central bank should purchase performing assets from non-banks, which means that they're buying assets from, say, pension funds, other investors, could be anything. And then their accounts at the banks are credited with newly created money, and that's how you push money straight into the economy. The Bank of Japan did neither of that, and therefore, and they called it QE, but it wasn't really QE, and it had no effect. In 2008, the Federal Reserve took half of my advice and it purchased the non-performing assets of banks, which is why the US banks recovered quickest after the 2008 crisis, even though the crisis started in the US, whereas European banks and Bank of England, they didn't do that. They just did what the Japanese central bank did, and which doesn't really work. But that was only half of my advice, and that half doesn't create inflation. It's not even money creation, because simply it's a sort of cleaning up of bank balance sheets between the central bank and the banks, which itself doesn't push any money into the economy. That's why you don't get inflation. So when 2008 happened and the Fed massively purchased assets, non-performing assets from banks, some people were then saying, oh, we're going to get inflation. It's quite clear to me that this would not lead to inflation. You can't create inflation this way. However, in 2020, suddenly they did the second half of my original advice, which was designed, as I said, for deflation, contracting money supply, lack of money being the problem. But in 2020, the situation was very different. Banks were creating a lot of money in the US, in Europe, in Japan. And then on top of that, the central banks forced the banks to create massive amounts of money by purchasing performing assets from non-banks, which was this trick and key part of this QE policy. which was a key part of this QE policy. And as a result, of course, you had to create inflation, and that's what they did. And so it was very clear that we were going to get massive inflation around 18 months later, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah, that's where we are right now. And the Fed's response is interest rates, messing around with interest rates. Is this going to work?
Interest rates are a lagging indicator, which is why the Department of Business, in the US has it in its indicators. You've got leading indicators, lagging indicators, and coincident indicators. It is a lagging indicator. It always follows the cycle. My work has also shown that it's not a monetary policy tool. It's just a lagging indicator positively following the economy. If you want to know what's going to happen, you have to look at credit creation. That's leading, that's ahead of the cycle. And credit creation, so they massively revved it up in 2020. Then it started to slow by the end of, by 21. And which is why inflation is coming down, and it's not, inflation is not going to go up and up and up forever at this stage. It's already peaked. But then the most recent data shows that we've got another surge in credit creation, but that's ahead of things. So at the moment, we're in the period where the economy is still catching up with the credit creation in terms of the slowdown. And then after a while, we're going to get a pickup again. That's the current credit creation data, what it's telling us.
So you're saying we're going to have inflation again. So we're seeing it decline, but it's coming back.
Well, yes, but it can also be part of the recovery. So it's going to be a combination of accelerating real growth and then likely also inflation coming back again. But to what extent, that's still not quite decided. We have to look at the breakdown. Also, you have to look at where the new money creation is being spent. A lot more now, very different to 2020, is going into the real economy. Therefore, at the moment, it looks like it's going to be less inflation and more real growth, which is good news.
Right. So explain that a little bit. I've heard, I have to be honest with you, economy stuff is like way over my head. For many of us, we just start to get, our eyes start to glaze over when we start to hear this stuff. And we're like, just tell me, is my money going to be worth something or is it going to be worth nothing? That's what I think people really want to know. But you have talked a lot about the real economy, money going into the real economy, the creation. One of the reasons why you advocate for a community banking is because community banks would lend money to smaller entities rather than, large institutions only want to lend to large institutions. And that sort of sucks the wealth and sucks the economy into the few, the hands of the few who are ultra wealthy, versus getting it into the smaller shops, kind of the mom and pop stores, I would suppose. So you're saying that that's now happening, that there's actually more money going into the real economy, which is smaller stores, smaller entities, and that's really how we're going to get out of this crisis.
Yes, and of course we have to make sure that this will continue to happen. Unfortunately, these crises have hurt a lot of companies, small firms. A lot of small firms were shut down in the last 3 years. Also, small banks were forced to merge with bigger ones. That's another problem. So there is still an imperative to create more local banks and make sure the economy stays decentralized. The central planners don't like that. They want to centralize. They want companies and banks to merge. But that's really the path to a Sovietized system. Too much central control. We need to do the opposite. We also need to really support cash, because cash is also decentralization and freedom, whereas anything digital and central is going to be about control. And to support cash is a key way to preserve our freedom. And we should really do everything we can to prevent the introduction of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, because that is the epitome of a centralized, controlled even totalitarian system, because of course they're going to be programmable and they will be programmed, and it's just nothing like we've ever had in the past. And any totalitarian dictatorship could only dream of such enormous control tools. We have to prevent that. And so decentralize, use cash, support your local bank, help setting up local banks.
You're such an interesting figure. I think you're like blowing people's minds right now because on one hand, a lot of people would blame you, right, as the person who invented quantitative easing for the crises that we're in. And it was just sort of delaying. And now many people look at it as one of the biggest economic, just like a colossal policy mistake. And at the same time, a lot of those people that feel that way are also the very people who don't trust this central digital currency, don't trust the World Economic Forum, and you seem to be also in that group. So, that I think that blows a lot of people's minds. They don't really know what to make of you and your policies. Which way, are you the good guy or are you the bad guy? I think a lot of people can't quite figure this out. But how much would you say to blame for the current inflation then, in layman's terms, the money that was created, I don't know if you want to call it printing money, that happened during the 2020 crisis when they were just saying, okay, we're just going to have to start dumping money, creating money. How much of that has to do with the current inflation crisis?
It's entirely due to that. So the inflation that started last year, well, it started late 21, and throughout 22, was entirely due to central bank policy decisions, nothing to do with energy, wars, and things like that. Just like in the 1970s, you can go back and do the same test. If you look at credit creation, its use, its disaggregation, where it went, it's very clear. And these things happened first through central banks, and they took these policies in a coordinated fashion, and they're intentional policies. So nobody can say, oh, this was a mistake. So they on purpose created this inflation. That's what my work shows, and there's no doubt about that.
And that is different than quantitative easing, or is that the same?
It's using the quantitative easing that is designed for deflation and contracting money supply for a time period when we already had expanding money supply and we were restricting supply in the economy and expanding demand. So it had to create inflation, and it was not designed for this situation.
So they were using the policy incorrectly.
Absolutely. And, well, that is assuming that you don't want inflation. I can only look at the revealed preference, what their actions show. And you were saying before, good guy, bad guy, look at the fruits, we'll look at the outcome. And the outcome is they created inflation. We know that it's a policy decision that they made. And so we can only conclude they seem to have wanted to do this.
Yeah, I really want to have a much longer conversation with you at some point about the dubious nature of central planning, about this idea, because you're alluding to it now, that they're trying to do this. They're purposefully creating this. And then also just the purposefully trying to kill small banks, community banks. They're purposefully trying to suck them up. They're purposefully trying to consolidate the economy into the hands of a few rather than building the real economy, it seems. They're wanting to introduce digital currency. All of this seems to boil down to their desire to control us and control society. And I think a big question to that is, why would they want to do that? Why would they want to risk that? I mean, the pitchforks would be coming.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think human nature is the answer. Human nature, unfortunately, is weak when there are temptations, and the temptation to use and abuse power is very large. As Lord Acton says, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. That's precisely where we need to prevent CBDCs. But it is a bigger topic, and I'd love to tell you more about the evidence that led me to this shocking conclusion that is intentional. And really, I want to have the opportunity to explain this evidence and let your viewers look at that evidence and come to their own conclusions. Because one thing we've learned, we always have to be critical, whatever we hear, also in the media, and everyone should get the data, get the facts, and make up their own minds. And I hope we have another chance to do that very soon.
I hope so as well. Richard, thank you so much for taking time out to chat with us about this current inflation crisis and really clearing it up. A lot of people think, there are two sides to this. One side says it's all that money that was printed and created, or however you want to phrase it. And others say, oh, no, it's the war, it's the energy crisis, it's supply chain, it's all these other things. And you're saying, no, it's clearly this one thing that caused this. And they did it on purpose, which is even more fascinating. So we'll definitely talk about that at a future time. Richard, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Well, there you have it. Now would probably be a good time to invest in gold through Birch Gold rather than going along with whatever the government has planned for us. You could take your future into your own hands by investing in something stable in these unstable times. And the process of converting a traditional IRA or 401k into a precious metals IRA has been made simple by Birch Gold. To get started, simply visit birchgold.com/Kim and request a free info kit on gold, followed by a consultation with a precious metals specialist. Don't wait to find out what's going to happen with inflation or the value of the dollar, because who knows? Birch Gold has an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau and positive feedback from thousands of satisfied customers. They can be trusted to safeguard your future. So visit birchgold.com/Kim to take the first step in protecting your assets with gold.